Hello, and welcome to this episode of Not a Lady, a Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman podcast. My name is Sarah.
And my name's Kelly.
And this is episode 14 of season 1, titled Heroes.
Dun 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 dun.
So I have a couple things before we even start that I have to tell you, Kelly. The first thing, I had absolutely no recollection of this episode.
Really?
I know I've seen it, but I really had no recollection of it. And last time, I don't think I put it in the episode, but you were like trying to remind me of what it was about.
Yeah, and how much I don't like it.
I was gonna say, and I got such a big impression that you loathe this episode. And I gotta be honest with you, I don't think it's that bad. I didn't hate this episode.
I thought you were going to say you agreed with me for once. Wow, that was really shocking.
Well, that's why I'm going to tell you now, because I was so preparing myself to be strongly averse to this episode, and I'm not.
I don't want people to think I hate this episode. There's a lot of reasons not to like it. And maybe you just have a better, insight into, the middle school, high school girl brain mind because you're a teacher, but I don't. I was one, and that's about all I know.
No, that's totally okay. The other thing is, it seems like the Dr. Quinn fandom is pretty active on Instagram, and so that's where I do a lot of dialoguing with other people.
Not that, I just want people to know, not that I'm not involved, but Sarah is way more involved on social media, so if anyone responds to you, it's probably her, just because I'm in PA school and don't have all the time in the world.
But what I was gonna say is, we have far more engagement on Instagram than we do on Twitter. So every once in a while, I kind of pop on Twitter and type in Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman and see if there are any people in the Twitterverse having conversations about Dr. Quinn and if I can invite them into the conversation. And just a week ago, I'm not going to say this person's Twitter handle just because they didn't write into us, but I am going to read what they posted online because it's very relevant and it's about today's episode. And they posted this. Has anyone else been personally victimized by the 1993 episode Heroes from the Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman series? Now I'm deathly afraid of frostbite and have bad circulation. So when my hands get slightly cold, they go numb and bone white. And then a smiley face that's like, I'm scared.
Surprised that's what they learned from that episode more than anything. Also, that's really random and coincidental that they just recently posted that and we're reviewing.
That's why I was like, I have to mention this. It made me giggle. While you were personally victimized by this episode because Colleen's in love with Sully, someone else is deathly afraid of frostbite.
Well, yes, I have some feelings on that, so we should get started here.
Before we totally jump in, well, let's talk in detail about some write-ins related to rite of passage.
Do it.
So the first thing we need to talk about that multiple people mentioned was that we missed a super important Sully Dr. Mike subtext in the conversation that they have about Dr. Mike finding Ingrid and Matthew.
Which, by the way, this is kind of why it's good for you guys to interact because, yeah, I mean, a lot of times, I'll miss something, you'll miss something, but if we both miss something, it's nice to have that pointed out, and then it gives us, a new perspective, so I kind of enjoyed getting that, where I was like, oh, yeah, I didn't think of that at all.
Well, but here's the thing. Remember in the episode, I said that whole conversation that they had was very cryptic. They never actually fully said what they were meaning, which now that makes more sense to me because I was feeling like that whole conversation was cryptic. And now I'm like, oh, it's even more cryptic because I went back and watched it because I was like, did I really miss that?
That should have been obvious.
Yeah. And the conversation literally goes, she says, I found Ingrid and Matthew in the barn. And Sully goes, kissing? And she goes, yeah. And then he goes, so? And she's like, well, people may do things they regret. And he's like, so they pretend it didn't happen? And then she goes, sometimes it's too late for that. And I don't understand it anymore. Okay, Sure, you guys are saying that they're talking about their own kiss, which actually makes a lot of sense because we also said in the episode, how come no one's talking about the fact that they kissed last episode? So that does make me feel better. Like, okay, they put in this little thing, but I don't think it makes it make any more sense.
Yeah.
When people get excited, okay, so she was excited by her gift, but she kissed him on the cheek and he kissed her. So is she saying that he was excited, but then he's saying she's pretending like it didn't happen? But that doesn't make sense because then she says, well, sometimes it's too late to pretend like it didn't happen.
What does that mean?
I understand that people are really excited to be like, this is them not talking about their feelings. But I don't think it brings any clarity to why they're not talking about their feelings.
No. Other than there was a conversation about it that we didn't think there was any conversation about it, but there was kind of a conversation about it.
But it doesn't make any sense. So
yeah, but also, like, isn't that just, like, typical? I don't know. I'm, like, kind of like, yeah, that actually makes sense for them to, like, try to avoid that.
But the reasoning doesn't make sense either because
No,
I don't know who's saying
sure.
what. And I don't think that it makes the conversation any less cryptic than I felt like it was. And now there's another layer to the crypticness.
For sure. And also I feel like the scenarios are a little bit different. So it's not a total stretch, but I think that's why I missed it because I was so focused on the fact that I thought she was talking about Matthew and Ingrid doing something they would regret. I wasn't thinking of like, oh, that's why they're pretending. You know what I mean? So
no, exactly.
Interesting. Appreciate you guys sharing that though.
Yeah.
I have a lesson from Frangipani00, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, on Instagram. And they were saying that Matthew learned that Sully was someone he could trust and approach for guidance. After the awkward birds and bees talk where Sully finished by saying, "Have you got any questions?" Matthew later did seek out Sully to ask advice about marrying and just growing up in general. They said, "I think Sully was glad to be able to offer help and a different perspective after he had seen the frustration that both Michaela and Matthew were feeling about the situation." Which I think is true. No, I don't have any questions about that, but yes, I still want your opinion on other things. Without it being forced down my throat by my mother. Because you know he knew that Dr. Mike was like, "Can you go talk to him?"
Right. We also got an email from a grateful fan who wrote kind of in the similar vein, focusing on Matthew and Sully's relationship in this episode, saying, "It's interesting that Matthew ran to Sully just like Brian did in the pilot. Which is funny that Sully is the stable influence in this family's life, seeing that he's actually the hardest to locate. Like, it would be nice to talk to Sully right now. Wish we knew where he was. Let's create a scene so he'll just pop out of nowhere." I feel like he just shows up when he's in the mood to make a difference.
Which that will be a little applicable in this episode.
But I do think it is important that the writers have done this very subtle thing where... yeah, the kids already see Sully as this figure, this person to go to. Unfortunately, it'll get messed up in Heroes. Or go farther than we want it to, right, Kelly?
Right. Yes.
But yeah, I like the relationships that they've kind of built subtly into the story.
Right. Also added on Instagram by Frangipani00 was that I learned that Dr. Mike can be a bit passive-aggressive in this episode. For example, towards Ingrid when she said, "You should avoid getting overly excited," and then she was unnecessarily forceful when examining Ingrid's throat. Also when she told Matthew, "I'd like to take you to St. Louis," when she really meant, "I'd like to take you away from Ingrid." I'm not sure I totally agree with the last statement just because I don't know exactly what Dr. Mike's intentions were. I think it was more like, if you're going to grow up, I want to give you this experience to the world and college and all that.
And not marriage at 16.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, probably hand in hand, but...
it's not personal toward Ingrid. She probably, whoever he would have been interested in marrying at 16 would have gotten this response.
That's true. Yeah.
Grateful fan said... you guys kind of hit on it, but Dr. Quinn goes to extreme lengths in this episode, of course out of her promise to Charlotte, but also because she really thinks of herself as these children's mother, and she loves them and wants what's best for them. Yes, it is what she thinks is best, and has her feeling some kind of way within herself, but it's for sure out of love, which I think is true. Like you kind of said, it's not intentionally harsh towards Ingrid, it's more out of overwhelming protectiveness of Matthew and his future and all that kind of thing.
Right.
We got an email from Liz Marie, who definitely mentioned the missed subtle conversation between Sully and Dr. Mike, but also added that she learned in this episode what a spinster is, not to be confused with an old maid. She also said that she learned that Dr. Mike is a better person than me because she was nice to Matthew, even though he never apologized. I don't know that I would say that it makes someone a better person, but I think being able to forgive and look past someone's emotional breakdowns and love them anyway, in a way, like, unconditional love is we love people despite the fact that they may hurt us or let us down. She also wrote in a lot of really cool stuff of things, just responses to things in the episode, from, like, needing an extra scene with Ingrid to see how she progressed to being like, I need to leave Colorado Springs, to not marrying your first love, to knowing how to successfully approach sensitive subjects with young people. And she also said that she really appreciates how the show keeps teaching viewers about the Cheyenne and their traditions. Cloud Dancing and Snowbird are two of her, who we will meet in this episode. Snowbird we will meet, are two of very few Native American characters that she remembered being on TV and that were treated with respect. And so she's excited for us to keep watching and getting to see that.
I've enjoyed that too. I feel like I've learned a lot as well. Thanks for writing in, guys. We always appreciate your comments. Don't forget that you can do it for this episode as well. And be sure to check us out on all our social media and our email that we'll, again, as always, mention at the end.
So, let's talk about this episode. Season 1, Episode 14, Heroes, aired on the 1st of May, 1993. It was directed by Reza Badiyi, Badiyyi. This director, Mr. Badiyi, actually has quite a resume, working on many of our favorite Start TV shows, such as In the Heat of the Night, Cagney and Lacey, Early Edition, Baywatch, and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This is the one and only episode that he will direct for Dr. Quinn.
Only one episode, wow.
And it's one you hate.
It's... I was gonna say, maybe there's a reason you didn't come back. But I don't know.
The writer, Toni Perling, is back. The last we heard from her was Happy Birthday, which is also ironic because one you love to this one. And of course, Beth Sullivan gets creator credit. Would you like to open us up with scene 1?
Let's do it. We're in town, and Colleen is running over to the post office to pick up a present for Dr. Mike. But before that happens, we have the return of Alice. Do you remember Alice?
You know what's funny? They never say her name the whole time, and I was like, I know this is the birthday party girl, but I cannot remember her name.
Yes, Alice and her
posse.
Followers.
Her disciples.
Oh gosh, don't say that. I guess followers made you think of that, huh? They're there to pick up the weekly, which has Rocky Mountain Heroes, a featured story in it. Which, I guess weekly, that's just the newspaper, right?
Correct.
Okay. So they're there to pick that up, very anxious, even though Colleen got there first. We also are introduced to Lewis, who is Horace's nephew.
Played by actor David Tom.
Cute little boy. And
does he, I don't know that you even know this movie. He reminds me so much of Milo from Atlantis.
Oh, no, I was going to say, but I can see that.
Were you going to say Eugene Meltzner?
I was thinking Eugene Meltzner, or I was thinking he reminds me of the dad from Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. As like a kid.
Oh. All acceptable answers. Basically, he looks a little nerdy.
And he is a bit nerdy because he finds this stethoscope very interesting. And Colleen's really cute because she's like, oh, like, you want to listen with it? Does she listen to his heart?
No, she lets him listen to hers.
Which, scandalous. But my one complaint, and one thing I want to say to everyone here.
She does it with her clothes on.
Thank you. And can I tell you, if I've learned anything from physician assistant school, that is the one thing that my professors has harped on more than anything. And we had to do all these physical exams, like practicals, and that was major. You should never do that. And if a doctor ever does that to you, which a lot of them do, I just had my gastroenterologist do it the other day.
I was gonna say, I'm pretty sure majority of my
they should not do that.
Checkups.
Though. Most times people, I think they do it because they don't want to take the time that it takes for people to take off their clothes. They want to just go quickly, but it's really incorrect and you cannot hear accurately that way. But anyway.
But it would be a little inappropriate for Colleen to take her clothes off.
Oh, for sure. And that's why I'm like, it's a little scandalous because I couldn't remember if he listened to her heart. He listened to her heart, which of course, yeah, he's not a doctor, he shouldn't be doing that. But yeah, that would be weird. So let's go on to the next thing that happens.
Well, the girls finally get their weekly and start reading Rocky Mountain Hero. And it is very obviously from the few sentences that we are witness to that this is a romance story. Now, let's talk about the history of the romance.
Ooh, give it to us, English teacher.
The first time we get what would be known as the ancient romance is going to be, there were ancient Greek romance novels. Few of them have survived to the modern day. The modern precursor to the romance novel would have come around in 1740. Now, there's a lot of history built up around what is a romance novel. I would say I don't like romance novels, but I love Jane Austen. And technically in 1813, Jane Austen is definitely an influence on what would become the romance genre of literature. And then in 1847, inspired very much by her, you would get the Bronte sisters, doing things like Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights. And there are subgenres within the romance genre. Everything from those scandalous dollar books that you see at like Dollar Tree that are like bodice rippers to what I would say probably I read as a teen, which was like inspirational romance, which is
Christian fiction.
Yeah. There's going to be a lot of progression as far as like what makes romance, because then you get historical romance too. Then you get the weird like paranormal romance, time travel, multicultural, and then you get your like, I've never read or seen the movie, but chick lit, which would be Bridget Jones's Diary, which is based off of Pride and Prejudice, but it's like modern interpretation. So the romance has developed and has many legs. So I guess what I learned is I shouldn't just say, "Ooh, I don't like to read romance," because that's not true, because I really appreciate Jane Austen in all her wit. However, I also want to mention, you asked a question about the weekly, and it's interesting that at the end of this scene, Dr. Mike calls for Colleen, and she asks for last week's weekly.
Right.
To read the previous installment of
the
story. So weekly or serial narratives, as they were called, the serial, which would later become, our series. I was really proud of myself because I actually was like thinking to myself, who the most famous author I know who produced novels through serial publishings where he would release parts of stories in the newspaper, weekly, monthly, sometimes longer gaps, was Charles Dickens. In 1836, which would be about 30 plus years before, where we are in Dr. Quinn, Charles Dickens would publish pieces of some of his novels in serial kind of story chunks. And people would buy the newspapers to read the next installment of the story. It's really interesting to see this type of historical literature because I don't feel like we see this as much in written form. You'll have things now that are like webtoons, right? Or like cartoons, the Sunday cartoons. People
right.
Some of them are series built. I just thought it worth mentioning is that in 1851, prior to the Civil War, Harriet Beecher Stowe's very famous Uncle Tom's Cabin was released as a serial in an abolitionist newspaper. And so you wonder how these pieces of literature, especially released in these smaller chunks, how they really influenced not only culture, but politics and perspectives. And I think that the portrayal here of these girls, you know, getting swept up in this romance is not unlike what we might see in modern day when it comes to things like television, right? Where we wait for weekly episodes to see what happens next in the story.
Definitely.
You know, with the birth of Netflix and streaming, especially with quarantine, the binge, people are moving away from waiting weekly. I'm a chief example of this because I waited until all the new season 2 Mandalorian episodes were out before I went and just like watched it in like 3 days because I didn't want to wait every week for 8 or 9 weeks to find out what happened. But especially when we get to, you know, we mentioned at the beginning of this Eugene Meltzner, who's from a radio drama, Focus on the Family radio drama called Adventures in Odyssey, like the radio series that would be the next progression in this idea of weekly stories, and then obviously television shows would come from that. And so I think it's really cool historically just to think about the path that storytelling has taken from, you know, if we're talking like oral literature where people are sharing stories, to printed in the newspaper weekly, to radio, to television, and the birth of the fangirl, right? I mean, how are these 4 girls talking about cult any different from some Dr. Quinn fans talking about Byron Sully?
Oh no, don't make that comparison.
Come on.
It's true.
I just really liked getting that little glimpse.
I was kind of mad though because she picks the girls in reading the story over Lewis, who's like, do you want to see my microscope? And she's like, maybe later. She's like, I'd rather go hang out with them. I'm like, come on.
Well, but at the same time, we know how important it was in a previous episode that to be friends with these girls, even though she knows she's a little different. So when the one girl especially like invites her, it's not wanting to risk an invitation that wasn't orchestrated by Alice's aunt and her, you know, mother.
Yes. Yes.
As this is going on, Dr. Mike and Sully are packing up some supplies onto their horses. We learn later that they're getting ready to go to the Cheyenne Reservation. And they notice some rowdy, at first I'm like, there's some rowdy boys over by the Mercantile.
Cowboys.
And you can't tell if they're like causing trouble, but it seems like they're just happy to be around supplies and civilization. And Sully makes a comment that they are cowboys off the Goodnight Trail. I'm coming to realize that Dr. Quinn likes to just throw their historical stuff kind of all at the beginning. Just be like, let's just throw this one line in.
I feel like you always have a lot more, work to do than I do.
At the beginning, because then the doctor stuff comes later. So the Goodnight Trail is actually a reference to the Goodnight Loving Trail, which you might be like, what an interesting name for a trail, but it is named after Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving, who were 2 cattlemen and ranchers. Charles Goodnight actually is known as the father of the Texas Panhandle. So these are 2 very influential men. They worked to establish this cattle trail in the late 1860s, and it was for transporting of beef, specifically beef from Texas Longhorns. Do you know the Texas Longhorn cattle?
The restaurant? I'm joking, guys. I'm joking. Yes, I know the Texas Longhorn. I've seen them before.
You're fired.
If I haven't, should have been already. That was bad English. You know what I meant.
The trail began in Fort Belknap, Texas, went through New Mexico, Colorado, specifically Denver, and Wyoming, which we know that Colorado Springs has kind of been interchangeable with some historical things that happened in Denver.
Right.
What's interesting and I think worth mentioning is the reason that they were transporting and moving all these cattle, especially into New Mexico, was because in 1866, 8,000 Navajo Native Americans were interned on a reservation near Fort Sumner in New Mexico. And the conditions were really poor there, and the government had to feed those being kept on the reservation. The majority of these cattle ended up being bought by the U.S. government for 8 cents a pound.
Wow.
For beef, and was used to feed these Native Americans who were being forced on the reservation. So while I want to acknowledge, like, it's super amazing how they transported, you know, we're talking thousands of head of cattle. Some of the reasons why that cattle was needed is an unfortunate piece of U.S. history.
Right.
That being said, it does make sense that the cowboys would need to stop into towns nearby to collect supplies, as when they got out on the trail, most of the trail did not pass through any major towns.
So while they are getting supplies from Mr. Bray's, somehow some I don't really know what they're carrying, just I guess supplies in general, it gets dropped and ends up kind of spooking the horses and letting the horses go loose. The horses connected to their wagon. Well, while this is happening, we know Colleen is trying to catch up on last week's story. She's walking through town, very engaged in this romantic story, while these horses are going loose in town. And somehow, she doesn't quite have the instincts to stop, drop, and roll. And
don't stop, drop, and roll when you're about to get run over by horses.
Roll out of the road probably would have been faster than what she did, because by the time she realizes...
There is a mistake in giving Dr. Mike time to call her name so that she looks up and has time to scream about what's about to happen to her. It almost would have been better if Sully just, like, saw and then pushed her out of the way. But it does seem like she should have had enough time to move.
You know.
I don't doubt that, though, in a small town like that where they probably don't get a lot of traffic. And normally, if there was a wagon that was being driven by people...
They would have been like, get out the way. Yeah.
Right. Like, either they would yell at her or go around her, you would think.
Yeah.
But it's because it's a runaway wagon.
Right. And so, as we've alluded to, Sully kind of saves her by jumping in and moving her out of the way from getting run over by the horses in the wagon. And then we have title sequence.
Well, I do want to say, I think the stunt work where they show the guy actually being dragged behind the wagon is top notch. Like, that guy, that stuntman, actually got dragged and kind of gets flung off to the side. And I was like, oh, that's a good shot. Like, that's intense.
Right.
After the title sequence, we see that, we would assume that same guy getting patched up.
Dr. Mike is casting Mr. Bose, one of the cowboys' arm in the clinic. And as Sarah said before, Sully and Mike were planning on going to the reservation. So she tells Sully, like, I'm going to be busy here. I'm not able to go. And Colleen is quite eager to volunteer in Dr. Mike's place to go with Sully to the reservation.
Because we saw briefly after she was rescued by Sully that she calls him Colt, which is the hero in Rocky Mountain Hero.
Some mixing of stories here. And this is kind of my problem with a lot of these romance books, movies, shows, is people think some of that stuff is real life. And a lot of them are, spoiler alert, guys, not real life.
As we watch a television show with a great romance.
Yeah, it's probably a bad example to say it for this. No judgment, guys. Here we are, watching the show with you, trust me.
You just said no judgment. Does that extend to Colleen as well?
No judgment for
grown
teenage
women.
Girls, you know, but maybe just a little.
The next scene, we are in Grace's cafe, and can we talk about Grace's hair in this episode? Because it is gorgeous.
Yeah, she always has nice hair, like a braid or a twist or something.
But I think this is the first time we've ever seen it, like, partially down. Mm-hmm. It is so pretty. I don't know.
No, it does look nice down.
Extra
She is
beautiful.
really pretty. Yeah. But unfortunately... Unfortunately, our good friend, Hank, is in the cafe, and he's kind of ticked off. Just a little. Actually, not a little, a lot. He's overturning tables and screaming. I don't like the way he, like, screams in her face. Something about his tone is very scary.
He's a scary guy.
Any man yelling, is scary, but, like, something about the way he is doing it is, I don't know, his tone of voice, but he's screaming that Grace's food poisoned him. And in this process, he has accused her, and now people are starting to get suspicious. By people, I mean customers. So he's basically running customers off. And there's kind of this even nastier part, because Robert E. kind of tries to step in and stop him from doing more damage, in which Hank replies, "Get your dirty hands off me," which
unfortunately will not be the worst of his insults in this episode. His very racist insults. Let's call it for what it is.
Yes. And I don't know, I kind of got, I kind of get the feeling that Hank is drunk.
Yes, I got that feeling too.
He's drunk and he got sick, and now he's coming back over here because he needs someone to blame it on.
Yeah. We'll talk more about Hank later.
We will?
Instead, Sully and Colleen have arrived at the Cheyenne Reservation, where we meet Snowbird for the first time.
I love Snowbird.
Played by Tantu Cardinal, who is a star of, like, some of the most iconic Native American-centered films, like Dances with Wolves, Smoke Signals, Legends of the Fall.
I didn't know that.
She's, like, a true queen. We see Colleen bandaging her cut, which I love that Colleen has observed Dr. Mike so much that she can go. It does seem a little bit, at first to me, I'm like, wait, why? Why did they ask Dr. Mike to do this? But then they kind of make it into a joke.
Right.
Where it's like, oh, my medicine man husband was too busy to look at a little cut like this. So they kind of explain, it was a special...
That Snowbird and Dr. Mike like spending time together.
Yeah. And we are also introduced, we don't really get to meet him, but we find out Cloud Dancing's son
walks on Cloud.
We kind of see him far off, where he is newly or soon to be married, engaged, and has a romantic interaction with his wife-to-be. And Colleen takes extra note, which makes sense because she's just been reading this very romantic little story, and so then she's got questions. How do you know if a man, what does she ask?
Want to marry you.
Yeah. I think Snowbird's kind of like, oh, he just hangs out at your lodge a lot.
It's cute. I really like her answers to stuff, and getting to see a little bit into her and Cloud Dancing's relationship for sure. But we do see this moment where Walks on Cloud puts a blanket over him and his girlfriend, fiance, and Snowbird explains that that's kind of the thing you do to talk and get to know each other and spend time together, is be under this blanket. Which, ill-timed, because the wind blows. And Colleen gets a chill, in which, being the gentleman he is, Sully kind of goes to give her his poncho, his nice red poncho that's kind of iconic. And she says, we can share. And so next thing we know, we see a similar scene to what we just saw, which is Colleen and Sully under this blanket together. So we've made connections here of where Colleen's mind may or may not be going.
And I think Sully is just being really sweet to Colleen, and it's really nice, actually. Because I feel like a lot of the interactions we've seen with them so far have been like her asking him to dance with her, and him being like, oh, I can't promise anything. There's been a lot of disappointments as far as, like, Colleen's relationship with Sully.
That's true. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, and so I do like that they're showing... Because he doesn't... In the former times where he's had to, like, blow her off, it hasn't been because of her. It's more than, we're breaking a prisoner out of, Custer's jail. And, they were having to run from, soldiers, whatever. But in this case, like, seeing, like, he really... is being intentional about, because we've seen him spend time with Matthew in Rite of Passage. We've seen him, I think, about the healing, taking Brian hunting for the first time. And so this is, like, the first time that we've really been able to see Sully investing in his relationship with Colleen, which is nice. And they end up riding back to town.
Yeah.
And she's in heaven.
Yeah, she's kind of like...
She's daydreaming. Come on, you never daydreamed?
Not with my head and arms wrapped around a grown man.
If it was Joe Lando, you would change your mind.
Okay. Well, the other girls, Alice and her crew, see this happening. And so when Colleen gets off the horse and everything, they start asking about Colleen being alone with Sully and what they did and what that looked like. And so Colleen kind of blows off Lewis in the process, and they go sit down underneath this tree to finish the rest of the story, the Rocky Mountain Hero story. But even before that, there's this whole, like, real escalation, because then it's like, when do you think Sully will ask you to marry him? Sorry, what? Did nobody miss, like, all this stuff going on between Dr. Mike and Sully? Like, is the town just, like, completely oblivious? Or are they just... I don't know. Maybe teenage girls don't pay attention to those things. Or maybe they're just like, oh, you were alone with the boy. That's so cool.
How many adult romances do you remember paying attention to as a child?
Yeah, that's true. I'm just saying, I guess, you know, it seems like this big escalation to me. But I guess that's the assumption of they've spent time alone together. And to the girls, that's very significant.
And we've talked about before, like, Sully in the town is kind of like this other, right? Mm-hmm. Like, he's in between the world of, like, the town and, like, the native way of life, and everyone knows the tragedy he's been to. People have seen him beat up other guys, right? Because we've all seen him in the streets beating up Hank and his croonies, and we've seen him, you know, throw his tomahawk and stand and translate for many a treaty between the natives and the army, military. So I feel like it makes sense that even for all these little girls to kind of be like, Sully's this exotic, like, cool thing, and Colleen has an entrance into his world. Right. It is weird. I will say, like, when they're like, when do you think he's gonna marry you? You know, his wife was only 3 years older than you, which I'm like, wrong, unless Colleen has gotten older, because last we checked with Colleen, she was 13.
And we know that Abigail was, what, 16 when they got married?
No, we
18?
know that from Rite of Passage, Abigail was 18. So unless Colleen
is suddenly
15 years old, then there's...
Which maybe she is, we don't know.
I don't think so, because we know Matthew only just turned 16.
Yeah.
And they're definitely more than a year apart, and definitely... Only one of Dr. Mike's birthdays have...
Well, that's a whole nother story.
Dr. Quinn and its timeline.
Yeah.
Has a little trouble. So, I don't know. That could just be something as simple as a different writer wrote Rite of Passage than wrote Heroes.
Right. Forgot that they had mentioned that Abigail was 18.
And so this is where the show Bible comes in.
I was just thinking about that. So it's fair. It's valid. We won't go argue.
It's a little mistake. And it only, I think, stands out in our eyes all the more clearly because we did just learn last episode that Abigail was 18.
Yeah.
I don't like this section of the story that we read because literally this woman, what is her name? Caroline. She writes to Colt, I fear for my virtue. But it gives the letter that they read about gives Colleen an idea.
She doesn't say anything except she runs over to Lewis, poor Lewis, just like gawking from afar, and says like, I need you to deliver a letter for me. His name is Sully. And so we kind of guess what's probably going to happen.
The next scene goes into where you ask the question, is no one been paying attention about Dr. Mike and Sully? Because we're in the clinic and Colleen straight up asked Dr. Mike, are you in love with Sully?
Yeah, like, obviously, if anyone knows that something might be going on, it should be her children because, I mean, come on. He's there all the time. He's very close with them. He's done so much for them. She knows that he's close with the family, but maybe she hasn't caught on. I don't know, because, I mean, I think Colleen she says, like, you've never really said if you love him or what.
But in Colleen's defense, and I don't even want to talk about this because I don't really understand Dr. Mike's response. First, she's like, I do love him. And we're like, yes. And then she's like, as a friend. And I'm like, what? But then what really bothers me, it's fine if she wants to say, I love him as a friend. But then she says, I think we'll only ever be friends. And Colleen's like, are you sure? And she's like, of course I'm sure. Why are you asking?
Here's what I got out of that. I got Dr. Mike. They have not had that define the relationship talk. We had this conversation last episode. So Dr. Mike, I think, is feeling defensive, does not know the nature of Colleen's questioning. And
True.
had she, would have probably responded very differently. I think in her mind, she's probably like, I don't really know what's happening more than that. Yeah, I mean, her saying, like, we'll probably all only ever be friends is probably a bit much just because she has no idea what's going on between them. But it's kind of like, you know, weren't you ever a kid and your friends are like, do you like so-and-so? And you're like, no, of course not.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like,
yes.
I think it's kind of like that, especially because it's Colleen asking, and so...
Yeah, I kind of get it from Dr. Mike's point of view. And at the same time, I think Colleen really here is like...
asking permission.
Yeah, like, is it okay? Because speaking of, like, middle school girls, but, you know, if your friend liked one of the boys in your class, you could not also like him.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think where it gets weird is where we're just like, he is a grown man and she is 13, you know. But at the same time, I'm thinking of it from Colleen's 13-year-old perspective. She's like making sure, is it okay if I have a crush on Sully? And here's the thing, don't get me wrong, Sully has a lot of admirable qualities. Dr. Mike will say this later. Well, she will list off all the reasons why she's sure that Colleen has good reason for liking Sully. But I do think we have to remind ourselves that Colleen here has fallen for the idea of this hero who's going to rescue her. Yeah. Really, she's fallen for this idea of being the damsel that Colt wants to save, and who kind of fits the idea of Colt? Sully. So it's really more about this fictional character than it is about Sully. But it's weird to us because we're like, it's Sully.
Yeah.
You can totally disagree
with
me,
I know.
Kelly.
I don't want to totally bash. I'm sure I'll have more comments to come as the episode progresses, because there are some things said and done that are more escalated than just this simple conversation that's happening right now, you know?
Yeah, this conversation, though, is important for Colleen and where she goes from here.
And I think it's just important to emphasize the fact that Dr. Mike doesn't know the nature of her questioning. And I think that's part of it, right? Because a mother would never assume, oh, you're asking this because you want to know if you're allowed to have feelings and act on them with this person that you know what I mean?
I don't know that the conversation would happen like this if it was Colleen's, like, biological mother. Like, this is where we get in kind of to the different layers of their relationship. Yes, she is her, you know, a mother figure, but at the same time, their relationship is different than, like, the relationship Colleen had with Charlotte.
True.
I don't really want to talk about the next scene, but we have to.
I know. We're at Bray's, and kind of, like, everybody's there. All the main townspeople. And Hank, once again, is accusing Grace. And then he gets up in Robertie's face, and somehow Robertie, like, keeps composure. But Hank leaves, and, I mean, I'm leaving out some bits and pieces here because, you know, Dr. Mike and the Reverend are kind of like, all right, we've had enough of this fighting, like, stop. But the really point of this scene is Grace gets really upset because she feels like no one is standing up to Hank. And especially when she says that, I mean, there's an emphasis because she's looking at Robert E.
Well, in a way, she's the only one who's standing up for herself.
Right. Even though everyone else clearly knows it's wrong and agrees with her and, you know, supports Grace, but it's not really outwardly given.
Yeah, and it's like a room full of people who should be her friends and her the closest relationship she has, and they don't stand up for her, and she stands up for herself, and that's when the Reverend and Dr. Mike are like, hey, that's enough, let's put aside our differences. Yeah. And to be honest, I mean, she has every right to call out. The way that he spoke to her and the words that he calls her are so much more than, like, putting aside your differences.
Right.
And I think this is the town's attitude too. Part of me wants to be like, is this white privilege to be like, it's just Hank, that's how he is, just let it go, Grace, just ignore him.
When she feels threatened, like she's gonna get kicked out, like she's gonna be forced out of the town.
Totally. I agree. And that's why I'm saying, like, is this me as a white person just being like, just ignore him, when it's really not only causing her to be fearful for her own life, but also a threat to her business.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
That's horrible, just to be like, oh, just ignore it.
True.
And so, like, watching this, I just had this, like, kind of this feeling of how easy it is just to, especially with people like Hank, because there are so many people like Hank in the world, you know? And most of the time, if you ignore them, they'll find someone else to pick on, right?
Yeah.
But that's really unfair to the people who in that moment are being targeted, to just be like, oh, don't worry, like,
it's dismissive, I think.
yeah, invalidating and dismissive. Good word.
Colleen is going up to the creek, or so she tells Brian, and he tries to follow, but she says, no, I'll be back before supper, and that's all that happens there. But we see her walking, and she finds this shack. She goes inside this shack, which...
It's not a shack, it's the front of an abandoned mine.
Was I supposed to know that?
Yeah.
How?
Because Carolina was trapped in an abandoned mine, and so that's the front shaft of an old mine.
Oh, I didn't think she was going to take it that far. Word for word, the story. I just thought it was a shack. Okay, well, she's doing that. And
you just thought there's a random shack in the woods?
Come on, it's Colorado. So she goes inside and she starts to finish the story, read the story. And instead of using Colt and Carolina, she's replacing the names with Sully and her own. Which we already knew. That's basically what she was doing in her own mind, but I think it's more solidifying of that thought in her head.
The clouds roll in. It's getting dark.
Cold. Wet.
Rain. And then I have to give props to the special effects team. You can tell they're like lightning strike on the tree. You can tell it's like underneath, but the way they have a full shot of that tree coming down on the front of the mine. I'm like, they actually toppled a tree on top of that. So I thought that was well shot. You see everything, you know exactly what's happening.
You always think about that stuff. I never think about that stuff because I'm like, I'm watching a show. This is a real thing. I'm never like, oh, how do they do that?
Because I like that aspect of
it's
movies.
Good insight.
It's probably because, you know, my theater teacher-ness and just love for film and all that. But unfortunately, with the tree coming down, it does block the entrance to the mine, therefore trapping Colleen inside.
I'm just like, go home, girl. Why don't you just go home now? You should have just gone home before. I mean, she should have gone home before, but she should have never gone. But I'm like, why are you not going home? Why don't you go home when it was getting cold? Like, she's dedicated. I'll give her that.
I mean, I agree with you. She should have gone home or never done it. But at the same time, I don't think she thought it would take that long.
Well, and that's what we haven't really talked about, is the assumption is that Lewis was supposed to take Sully the letter, and he was supposed to receive that letter before this point, which we're getting to. But back at the homestead, Dr. Mike, Matthew, and Brian are trying to figure out where Colleen is, why she's still not home, and Sully shows up and says that he'll go look for her just because it's getting cold, it's getting stormy, like we said. And I don't know if you noticed this, but Dr. Mike says she wants to go, and he actually does not try and, like, disagree or stop her, which is normally what he does.
But also, she says to the kids, I'm going with Sully, and then she turns around and looks at Sully and says, please let me go with you. Which is never how she's asked to go before, and I think that's also, I mean, there's probably a couple reasons. From his perspective, he's like, she's gonna go whether I say yes or no.
Yeah, we either fight about it or I just let it go.
But also, I think she's making a demand, I'm gonna go, and then she recognizes this never works out well for me. Please let me go with you. Yeah. And so they both, I think, in that moment, it's a very quick thing, but we learned how much they've grown to know and understand each other in a way, in just that little scene that I'm like, wow.
Yeah, no, definitely. So Sully and Mike go out looking. They're out looking for Colleen.
I hate this scene. Listen to the dialogue in this scene. Wolf can't get a scent. Will she be able to survive the cold? Yes. It's so cold. Obviously, Joe Lando and Jane Seymour work to sell the dialogue a little bit more, but it's bad writing, man. Like, they needed to cut that scene and put something else in. what I think is they had that wind machine going to show, and they were like, look how intense this looks. Which, do you know what may have happened? This may have not even been a scripted scene. This may have been the director's on set and is like, hey, let's use this wind machine more. Let's just shoot a little thing where you guys are looking for Colleen. Wolf can't get a scent. Will she survive the storm? It's so cold. Yes. Keep moving.
Or it's maybe also, like, yeah, they can show that it's, like, storming, but maybe they can't show that it's cold, because it's probably not. Like, they can't show them having, being able to see their breath, so they have to, like, reiterate, like, that's why she's gonna have frostbite, because it's cold, in case you didn't know, we need to emphasize. Yeah, that's true.
No, I think that's probably accurate, but I do just have to say, I was like, who wrote this scene? No one talks like this.
It's so
and
cool.
And where he's like, Wolf can't get a scent. What would be the next logical thing to say? Will she survive the storm?
She did not say it like that. You're dumb. But then they show Colleen, who's, like, asleep and freezing, and we see her try to use her hands, and she can't. She's crying over the fact that she can't move her hands.
Because she's been out all
night, and she's crying. She's trying to get out, but she's not able to, and so the understanding is that, yeah, her fingers are so frozen that she can't actually move them. Back at the post office, Lewis is a failure.
Horace is training Lewis to be a mini-me and tells him about how sacred the mail is, and you must not open it. And by the way, you need to deliver that letter, but oh, sorry, it's for Sully. You don't find Sully. Sully finds you.
I like that line. But also, yeah, I did write in my notes, I'm like, we talked about that earlier, but I'm like, man, Horace is real dedicated. He's like the poster child for Postman. He really is, though.
I just think it's funny that he's like, you have to deliver the letter. Oh, it's for Sully. You won't find him.
Right. He'll be in eventually whenever he wants to be. Yeah, for sure. And so, once again, we do know it's been the whole night. And so, I'm assuming that Dr. Mike and Sully have been out that whole time looking for them, which is pretty chilly for them, too. And Sully is reassuring a worried mother.
Well, I think it's good he has faith in Colleen. Like, even in this scene, it's a shame that Colleen didn't get to see, like, how much faith Sully has in her. Just as, like, she's lived here her whole life. She knows what to do. They're kind of imagining that she was out and then got stuck and had to find shelter. Unfortunately, she actually had set herself up for a bad situation where she wasn't able to really take care of herself. And then there's the little exchange where Dr. Mike's like, you're right. And he's like, yep, first time for everything. And I'm like, Sully, don't be flirting, you cute.
It's weird when you say it.
What? It's weird when I say things are cute?
Yeah.
Rude.
Sorry.
And then Wolf howls, the true hero of this episode that no one stinking talks about.
Who else is talking about it except us?
No, I just mean they talk about a lot of people being heroes in this episode, and no one talks about Wolf's a stinking hero.
You're right. Wolf's a hero.
Yeah. Wolf is my hero. You want to talk about cute? That dog.
Oh, is Benji hearing you say this?
He's asleep. Grace's cafe has suffered with a lack of business since Hank spread his idea that Grace poisoned him, which I just gotta say, I guess Colorado Springs is a suspicious town, because if someone told me, like, oh, I went to that restaurant and I got sick, it wouldn't stop me from going to that restaurant. What would be different if it was like 5 of my friends went to that restaurant and got sick? And even then, like, if I went to a restaurant and my friend got sick, but I didn't, it still wouldn't keep me from going there. And I can say that because that happened a lot in China. Maybe I just have a rock hard stomach.
It probably depends, right?
My roommate would come home from some restaurant sometimes and she would puke her guts out. And I would be like, yeah, I'm fine.
It depends, right? Nobody remembers. We were talking about this the other day when we were talking about hepatitis. I think a lot of people won't know this because I don't live on the East Coast, but Chi-Chi's. You remember Chi-Chi's? Chi-Chi's shut down because of a hepatitis A outbreak. Chi-Chi's, remember we used to go get, they had the best mac and cheese. It was like a Mexican restaurant.
I do not remember this.
Wow. Anyway, they shut down because I think there's like a Walgreens there now. because they had a hepatitis outbreak. It was like a big chain restaurant anyway. So it probably depends.
I remember the Ponderosa.
Yeah, me too. Ugh. Anyway, yeah, it probably depends why, but I mean, it's a small town, and as we kind of established when they first came up with Grace's Cafe, there's nowhere else to eat like that. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it is kind of shocking, but also, like you said,
and it's Hank. Who listens to Hank?
Hank's scary.
He is scary. Maybe that's why. That's why that one, fakey railroad guy was like, I'm going to recruit you to basically scare everyone into doing what I want. Which...
You were scary saying that.
That's the last time we've seen Hank really interact with Grace and Robert E. And I felt like they all stayed pretty calm in that former. Maybe it wasn't personal. Hank's made it personal. So the dialogue that happens is Grace is upset with Robert E. because he didn't stand up for her. And she feels like he's letting them run her out of town.
Right.
Which I don't know that as a viewer I totally feel that, but I can understand that that's what the story is trying to tell me, that that's what she's worried about. If she can't run her cafe, then she can't stay. Which prior to the cafe, she was working for Olive, so I'm like, it's hard for me to feel the stakes. But that doesn't make them any less real. I think I just, as a viewer, I had to like remind myself, okay, why is this so hard for, her business-wise? Obviously, personally, we can understand, but just what this means for her as making a living. And she accuses Robert E. of, you were brave enough to be the slave that ran away, which I think this is the first time that we learned that he was a fugitive.
Right.
We knew he had been a slave, but I don't think we realized that. But then she's like, why aren't you brave enough to stand up to Hank? It's meant to be really sweet where he says, I'm not going to start a fight like that with you in the middle of it. He doesn't want her to be collateral damage. That being said, I find it hard to understand how running away from oppressive slave owners is the same as standing up and fighting a very racist, seemingly violent white man. Because I'm more thinking of through history, especially after the Civil War, it wasn't like suddenly, equality and integration happened. And so there probably would have been bigger consequences for Robert E. if he had stood up to Hank. I have trouble seeing the connection between her being like, you were brave enough to run away. Why aren't you brave enough to stay and fight for me? But like I said, I understand she's feeling threatened. She's feeling hurt. She feels like she's not going to be able to stay. And the one person that she thought she would be able to count on to fight for her, she feels like failed her. I don't think we as the audience members feel like that, because we know that he would do whatever to protect her.
Right. But in that moment, she felt, alone.
Wolf has arrived outside the mine. Sully climbs in, finds Colleen. She's delirious. Did you notice Sully crawled in through this tiny little hole, and then he goes to carry her, and then they jump cut with him holding her outside. And I was
did think, how are they gonna get through that?
They didn't want to show
he
him
just
having
shoved
to
her. He shoved her through first, and then he had to belly crawl out after her, and then he picked her back up.
Yeah, it probably would have killed Colleen's romantic aspirations to see herself be shoved through the little hole and dragged out on the other side. Instead, she just gets the bridal carry.
We're too realistic. But she does call him Colt too, so
she's delirious.
Are you defending her?
She's delirious.
That's fine. I'm just saying she still has this weird fantasy that she's confusing with reality.
Because the good news is he did rescue her.
Right. At a cost, though, because Dr. Mike looks at her hands, and it's actually Sully who says it's frostbite, isn't it? And Mike says, yeah. So most people are familiar with frostbite, right? It's low temperatures over long periods of time can cause freezing of the skin, and it's
How long periods of time? Because I wondered, we don't know how cold it was that night, and obviously part of me is there was no snow, but that doesn't mean it wasn't cold. So I'm just wondering, like, how cold or how long do you have to be in the cold to develop frostbite?
Well, and it depends on the cold, right? It's going to depend on temperatures,
No,
So
yeah.
once sub-zero temperatures hit, I found out that it can take about 30 minutes for any exposed skin.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean, but
that's
I'm
not,
talking
that's
about...
not long.
No, and that's like continuous exposed skin. But at 15 below zero, and I'm talking Fahrenheit here for our international listeners, at 15 below Fahrenheit, even with wind chill, it could take only 15 minutes. So
Okay, so I guess it makes sense she was out there all night, even if it wasn't below freezing. That's a long time to be.
right, and even if she wasn't directly exposed to the wind either, because she's protected by the shack, but it's exposed skin, and she only had a shawl, and extremities usually are the first things to get frostbitten. And you literally have kind of like ice crystal formation happen that can cause, think about, all the vasculature and all the arteries and everything. It can cause your blood to coagulate and cause ischemia, which would mean that your skin muscles are not getting blood flow. And so I'm sure she has this numbness. I'm sure she's going to get swelling, blistering. It'll probably turn white. And we kind of see that a little bit white bluish tint to her hands that they kind of try to make happen. But it can be very severe and similar to kind of burn degrees. It's not usually compatible in lengths, but they use the same kind of system to give degrees to frostbite as they do to burn. So those are obviously opposite sides of the spectrum, but it's the same kind of idea. So it can be very serious. So they get back to town. All the townspeople are there kind of following. They get her into the clinic, and I actually thought it was very cool how Jake comes in and wants to help because he's familiar with frostbite and he knows that you're supposed to rub the extremities or wherever it is to get it warm. In which Dr. Mike says, actually, we've learned it's better to do it slowly. And then there's this conversation of like, who's we? Oh, we, the real doctors. And it's kind of sad because he ends up kind of getting kicked out. You can see he wants to help. But I'm also like, I'm pretty sure that's how Dr. Mike has felt multiple times, in the beginning when she's trying to come over there and help. And he kind of is like, I know more than you, go away.
Yeah.
But it is really interesting to me because there are a lot of theories out there. And I learned this when my best friend lives in Arctic Canada, and I went to visit her, and it was like, negative 50 degrees, and she was saying that where she lives, which is in an Inuit village, that a lot of the Inuit believe that if you put cold snow, like a lot of them get it on their face, and if you put cold snow on your face, it actually can help because it's lowering the temperature slower than it would if you were to just put like, like a hot washcloth on it or something. Mm-hmm. But that kind of rewarming and rubbing is really not recommended, actually. So it's theories that a lot of people have, and probably if you Google it, it'll say those are things you can do.
So Jake was right or wrong?
Dr. Mike was right in saying that's not recommended. You don't want to do that. It's actually better to rewarm slowly, and if you were to come to the hospital, it would really be, and it has to be severe, right? You would probably get a warm bath with iodine or chlorhexidine in it or something to warm it as quickly as possible without burning the skin, because you don't want to go from extremes to opposite extreme, right? And that's the thing. Right. And that can take 15 minutes, that can take to an hour, but it is true that that's a painful process for the patient. More serious cases would need medication or surgery, amputation. That's a common cause, a common result of this. So we can see that she's having her hands dipped in warm water and it's painful for her. And that's realistic. And I think because she's in all this pain, she does not want Sully to see her like this. So she actually asked Dr. Mike to tell Sully to leave.
Dr. Mike steps outside of the clinic to tell Brian and Matthew that Colleen's okay, but she is worried about whether or not she'll be able to, I guess, save her fingers or her hands.
Yeah.
And Brian's comment is, if her hands don't work, how's she gonna become a doctor? And I'm like, hey, have you ever seen Doctor Strange?
That's a different kind of doctor, isn't it?
Bro, he's a doctor who gets in a car accident and all the glass gets in his hands, so his hands stop working, so he can't be a doctor anymore. So he goes to Asia to learn all sorts of mystical powers so that he can be another kind of doctor.
I've not seen that movie, but I'm pretty sure you just gave everyone the trailer in a little
Yes, I did.
You're welcome.
You should watch it. Benedict Cumberbatch.
I know who is Doctor Strange. I've just never watched it. The cowboys that we previously saw at the beginning of the episode are getting ready to leave, and Robert E. offers them a free meal before they go, which they don't turn down. And the assumption, I mean, it's not even an assumption. We know that he's going to probably take them over to Grace's.
And pay for it. He's probably going to pay for it. That's what I got, too. To get people eating there.
Right. Back at the clinic, though, Colleen's fingers are still looking very red. But Dr. Mike's trying to cheer her up, and she says, you know, Horace actually sent for the weekly to be brought to you. And so Mike starts reading the story per Colleen's request about Carolina and Colt. And I don't know, there's kind of this moment in her eyes where you almost, I don't know, it seems like she's figured out maybe where Colleen's intentions came from. Do you think that happened here, or do you think that was later?
I think at first it's eerily familiar, like she was trapped in a mine and he had to come to her rescue. So I think she's like, that's weird. But right. I don't think she's put it all together that this was intentional yet. At Grace's Cafe, the cowboys are having their meal, and Robert E. goes to talk to Grace, and she gives him a big kiss, and he is so surprised.
She calls him her hero.
And it's really sweet. And Myra shows up and says that she admires her for standing up to Hank. And you think it's so cool because Grace doesn't feel so alone. And then all of a sudden Hank is there and you're like, ugh, boo.
Right. He turns up and like throws the basket that Myra had on the ground that had all the food in it. Actually, Grace like starts to try and tell him off. And then
Robert E. punches him in the face.
Well, because...
Oh, yeah.
Hank goes to call her the N-word.
Yeah.
And Robert E. has had enough. And actually kind of, like, beats the crap out of Hank.
Hank's the worst, too. Like, watching this, my immediate fear was, like, that someone was gonna try and hurt Robert E. for hurting a white man. It is really awful that Robert E. and Grace have to, quote-unquote, handle Hank alone. Like, you really just wish, this is where we're, like, missing Kid Cole, right? Someone to be like, Hank, why are you here? Are you buying food from this business? No? Then get off the property.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Harass.
Like, yeah, like, because even in the scene in the mercantile, he doesn't buy anything. He just walks into the mercantile, you know, accuses her, attacks her, calls her, you know, nasty names, and then walks out.
I think he likes the power that he has to, like, incite fear in people, I think.
Yeah, and it's horrible. And so I did some reading, because it got me thinking about what life was like for a lot of Black people, especially after the Civil War. Some of them, obviously, freed slaves, some of them, you know, who may have been living in the North, who had been working in, you know, different sort of trades. Something that I read by Booker T. Washington, who you may know he's considered one of the most influential leaders of his time.
Right.
In 1895, he gave a speech where he called for Black people to focus on hard work and education instead of immediate equality and integration. And I don't know, it kind of made me sad that during this time, even Booker T. Washington was like, there is a long road to equality and integration, and the best thing that we being Black people in America can do is work hard for something you want to do and become educated, because those were two things that overall were and would still be for many years denied and limited to Black people in America. But it got me thinking about him saying that and how Robert E. and Grace here, that is what they're trying to do. They're trying to work hard and earn a living and live life, and Hank is, for some reason, doing everything within his power to make their life miserable. And so how, from that perspective, I want to be really proud of Robert E. of being like, hey, this is where I draw the line here. But at the same time, I'm like, it's unfair that he had to wait to draw it here.
Well, and maybe it's not even like that's where he's drawing the line. I think Grace has made it very clear that how she feels, and so this is the first opportunity since that conversation he's had to like really prove to her like I will stand up for you.
Yeah.
Either way, it's not great. And then the scene doesn't really exactly finish because we see that Lewis comes by the clinic to see Colleen.
And he literally is a mini Horace.
Dr. Mike says she's not really up for visitors right now. She's doing a treatment. And he brings up the fact that Colleen wrote a note to Sully and that he has not been able to get it to Sully. And so he clumsily leaves.
Like knocks over her whole thing.
Oh, he's totally a boy with a crush. In the process, Dr. Mike drops the letter and it falls open, and she now reads the letter that Colleen wrote to Sully, which...
And here it clicks.
This is probably, yeah.
That was on
that
purpose.
plus that equals this.
Sully is the one actually doing Colleen's treatment, and he's encouraging her. And Dr. Mike comes up and asks him if he'll come step downstairs to have a conversation with her, where she gives him the letter and she kind of explains what's happening. Actually, I think they're both like cool about it, because earlier Sully had said Colleen's growing up, and Dr. Mike's like, you were right, and I just didn't expect this. She makes a weird comment, you'd think I learned my lesson with Matthew and Ingrid, and I'm like, what does that mean?
What does that have to do with this?
Right. But I guess to do with maybe teenagers and romance or something. And then I think it's meant to be cute. It's a little awkward because she's like, I can see why she likes you, because you're kind and brave and handsome. And I'm like, are you using a 13-year-old as an excuse to tell Sully why you like him?
Yeah, I think it is intended to be sweet, but probably not the greatest time.
Which Sully, I think he tries to like apologize. He's like, I didn't realize that's what was happening. And she knows. She's like, no, it's not you at all. But she does kind of make a comment that maybe it would be better if he didn't do the treatments.
Yeah.
Give Colleen some space.
Well, don't they also have the conversation of like, they're waiting for her hands to get better, and Dr. Mike feels if they wait any longer that she might lose her hand to gangrene. And she actually says, if I don't see improvement by tomorrow, that's what I'm going to have to do.
Cut him off?
Yes, which, to be honest, amputation would obviously, as I stated before, be an option for frostbite. But usually healthcare professionals, providers would delay that kind of option for a few months to determine the extent of the injury in your hands or toes or whatever it may be. So they've
sped up the timeline a little bit.
Yes, but also they don't have the kind of management or knowledge at this point in time to maybe know what else can be done, and to be able to have the imaging and the blood work and the things to kind of figure out what the extent is. So I think that's where Dr. Mike is coming from. And when they get back upstairs...
Which is scary. That's a scary conversation to have.
No, of course. It is. And I think that's kind of why today they wait a while, because that changes quality of life if you were to lose your fingers like that. And Colleen is pretty frank and like, just tell me the truth, Dr. Mike. Like, I want to know. And then in this conversation is where Colleen asks Sully if he could love a girl who wasn't perfect. Meaning, didn't have hands.
We shouldn't laugh at that.
I know.
I think it's a scary thing to think that she's thinking about that. Right.
No, for sure. But then what bothers me is, one, it's kind of brave because she has never really come out and said to Dr. Mike, like, here's how I'm feeling about Sully. She had that whole, like, asking conversation, but I'm like, wow, that's really brave that you're just, like, letting Dr. Mike know that here's where you're at. And then also, I'm upset because Sully responds with, you're like, oh, this is a perfect moment for him to be, you think he's going to sit her down and be like, hey, I really care about you, but I don't have feelings for you like that.
No, this would be a terrible moment to be like, no, I don't love you, and it's because you're not going to have hands.
No, but it wouldn't be about that. He could say, like, I don't know.
The way that I see it is, this doesn't even have to be about her being in love with him. This is, could you love someone who was less than perfect? Meaning, could anyone?
No, that's not what she means. She means, could you?
No,
she's not asking, like, about mankind in general.
But but I think that's the way, listen, when I had my horseback riding accident, I have a gnarly scar, man. And I remember saying to mom and dad, no one is ever going to love me with this scar. And, you know, maybe if one boy had been like, I mean, I'm over it now, but like hearing someone say like, that would never keep me from wanting to marry you because you're, and this is where he gets it right. He says, not because he loves her. He says, no, he says, because you're special. It has nothing to do with your physical qualities. It has to do with you as a person. That is why someone would marry you.
Maybe if she was an adult and could understand the nature of him answering that question, but you know that she's not an adult and that whatever he says, she's going to take extremely personal and apply to her situation and her life. And if he says, of course I could, you know, if she's as special as you, I could love someone that's not perfect. It's this assumption that I just don't like it because I know in her mind, she's thinking, oh great, he does love me. He will love me no matter what happens. And that's not the kind of commitment you mean to be making to a child.
I don't really.
I think it could have been handled better. I see where you're coming from,
Yeah.
where it probably is a bad time to be like, by the way, like, let's address this situation. But I'm not sure him saying that and then like embracing her is going to mean that she's going to take that conversation better when it does happen, you know?
Yeah.
And then she says she hugs him and says she loves him, and you're just kind of like, I don't know, I feel like maybe Dr. Mike's like, oh, what? Like, this is going to make it worse.
You can love people who are not your family and it not be a romantic love, you know, like.
Of course, but that's not what's going on in her teenage brain.
You are correct. I guess it just doesn't bother me as much because I see a child who's scared and hurting and possibly about to enter into something very traumatic. And so in my mind, like you said, he's not making a commitment, even if she is, you know, like you said, even if in her brain she might be perceiving it as one. I don't think the way he words it comes off like that. I think the way he says it is more like, you're so special. Like, yeah, of course, that wouldn't change anything about you because who you are is more than your physical body.
Which, again, if the question had been asked and we were still in this mindset of, like, this is a father figure to her, I would say, yeah, of course.
Right.
But the problem is that that's not what this episode is about.
Lewis comes to visit right after this, and he is literally a Horace mini-me, and he brings flowers and chocolate, and this part bothered me more because did we just make it romantic to cut your own finger open and bleed on it?
He's like, I will bleed for you to look at this under the microscope. I like it because I'm nerdy and a science person, and I'm like, yeah. And we had to do that. When we did blood typing in college, everybody had to do that.
You had to cut your own finger?
I mean, you prick your own finger and you put it in a little thing and see how blood typing works, but...
Sepsis, bro.
Oh my gosh.
Maybe the sight of blood to me is not romantic. I mean, but she seems to be very impressed with it. Like, cool. And then she's like, you didn't have to do that. You didn't have to cut your finger open so I could look at you on a microscope.
True. Myra stops by.
Why did you say her name like that? Myra.
It's called voice intonation.
Myra.
Myra shows up and she's there to see Dr. Mike because she brings something that she has made the connection. It's kind of like bad water, making the connection of like, what's the precipitating factor that's causing people to be sick? Myra figures out it's this piece of raw meat that is making Hank sick every time he eats it.
So gross.
There's a lot of people that eat raw meat. She's also really cute because then she goes to leave and she's like, Lewis, tell your Uncle Horace I said hey. It's like, they don't get to see each other that often. I like it. It's cute. Lewis, being the scientist that he is, actually cuts a piece of it to look under the microscope. Colleen sees it and they both come to this conclusion of they have to show Dr. Mike. Even though they might not know what they're looking at, they have to show Dr. Mike.
I just appreciate this whole scene, like making the smart kid look cool.
Yeah, all for that.
Because it's so easy to make like, oh, nerdy guys are cute because they're sweet and compassionate. But here, actually, the fact that he's smart and intelligent is gonna help people. Which is like totally all of what Dr. Mike does. But I don't know, it's just cool to see it in a different way.
How come it's not cool when Dr. Mike does it? How come it's not cool when the ladies do the medicine? You only like when the boys do it?
No, that's not what I'm saying. It is cool when the women do it. I'm just saying, in the contrast to Sully, most people would look at a guy like Horace or a guy like Lewis and not give them the time of day. But the fact is here, actually, that Colleen takes note of how cool and smart and helpful Lewis is.
She does, which is also nice because she's kind of blown him off a number of times during this episode, so it's nice that she's actually giving him the time of day.
I don't feel like her blowing him off, though, has been intentionally malicious.
No, she's just been preoccupied with other things.
Yeah.
AKA
distracted.
Sully.
Her imagination.
Right. Downstairs, we're assuming this is later on, they've obviously showed Dr. Mike what's under the microscope, and she's there for Jake and Lauren and Hank, most importantly, and Myra to see. They see this spiral bacteria, and Dr. Mike does a really good job of explaining that it's trichinosis, which is a parasite, which, have you ever heard of trichinella?
No.
Really? Trichinella? You never heard of that? I thought maybe you had heard of it, because it's a parasite usually found in pork, raw or undercooked pork, and what happens is this parasite invades your intestines, which results in diarrhea, abdominal pain, vomiting, which is what Hank was probably experiencing.
Should that make us feel better that...
Yes, that he was suffering? Yes. Good. The parasite has these cysts, and when you eat it, the larvae are then released from the cysts and can multiply, and so it's...
That is
pretty gross.
disgusting.
Oh, for sure, for sure. That's what trichinella looks like under the microscope. They're very, like, spiral-looking parasites. And we would treat them with anti-parasitic drugs, mebendazole, albendazole, maybe prednisone today, but he just got to simply see the symptoms through and maybe cook your meat next time to avoid that. But the big thing with this scene is we realized that it had nothing to do with Grace. Had nothing to do with Grace or her cooking, and he basically tried to ruin her reputation in business by being a jerk.
Oh, and just treated her horribly.
Absolutely. You know, with no cause, we realize at all. And so...
Well, and he was wrong.
Oh, for sure. Not that he would ever admit that.
You know, in the Happy Birthday episode where Dr. Mike was like, you let me make a fool of myself. And Grace is like, oh, that was the best part. I really want someone to say to Hank, like, how does it feel knowing that you acted like a stupid head?
You and your insults, butt, stupid head, face. And I think the good part of this scene, though, is Lauren's like, what day is it? Meatloaf day? And then him and Jake, you know, that they're going to run over to Grace's, which is sweet. And I'm also kind of, like, mad. I'm like, why do you have to depend on his opinion so much? But
right.
Whatever. We've destroyed that kind of thinking. And I mean, food poisoning, which is most commonly Staph aureus, happens frequently, you know, to people. And it's not always a consistent thing with restaurants or whatever. It just sometimes happens based on the fact that they don't do a good job cooking or heating things. But
well, and Dr. Mike tells Hank he has to apologize. The least he can do.
Right.
He's not going to.
Yeah. The next scene.
Colleen uses her hands.
She does. She's able to grab the stethoscope and realizes her fingers are better, and she shows Dr. Mike, and Dr. Mike's like, wow, I guess there's no damage to the nerve endings. And then she's able to give Dr. Mike the stethoscope.
Yeah, I think we kind of, like, forgot that she, like, this was the first scene, and then she didn't actually get to give it to her because she had left it at the post office when they went to read the story, and then Lewis brought it over. And
yeah. And so Colleen is super excited about her hands, and she wants to see and tell Sully. To which Dr. Mike is put in this difficult situation where she's now forced to have that conversation that we've been alluding to, which is that she knows Colleen is quote-unquote sweet on him, and she tries to explain that Sully's feelings are not the same. But Colleen can't and won't believe that.
I do appreciate some of the blocking when Colleen is saying, like, I know he cares about me. Our feelings are real. I know our feelings are real. They actually have her turn away from Dr. Mike, which is a physicality of rejecting what Dr. Mike is saying. And she actually clutches the weekly to herself. Mm-hmm. And so it's almost in the same way that she's holding on. She knows it's a fantasy because she's holding on to this story. And I think there's a realization, like, this is something I made up, just like a story in my head. I think Colleen knows what Dr. Mike is saying is true. She never thought of, as far as we know, she never thought of Sully, you know, in a romantic way until she read this story. And it was because Sully fit the persona of this fictional hero that this character and all the other girls are kind of in love with. And so really, it's a realization that this was more something she wanted to create in her head as opposed to something that she truly, I think, believed was real. If Sully had just come to the, you know, if the storm hadn't happened and the letter had been delivered and he just showed up and was like, Colleen, what are you doing? And they would have had a conversation about it, and I think she would have been over it. But the fact that she actually did end up in danger and he actually did rescue her, it made the fantasy of this story she was reading come to life. And that's where I think I'm able to distance myself a little bit from Colleen, quote unquote, being in love with Sully. I don't really feel that's what's happening here. I think Colleen is in love with this idea of having this epic fantasy romance that she's read about in this story, and Sully fits the bill for it.
And the main thing that happens here is that Sully hears and he comes in and says, you know, it's true. I don't love you like that. And, you know, she's like, well, what about the blanket thing? And he's like, I'm sorry, I didn't think you were going to take it that way, which I think is true. Like, of course he wouldn't, but that's where her mind was at.
Yep.
She runs off. She's pretty devastated, and he follows her. You know, he tells Dr. Mike, like, no, like, let me try and...
Yep.
I don't know. This is hard because, you know, he says, like, Colleen, of course, you're smart, you're pretty, you're funny. Mm-hmm. I just don't care about you like that. I shouldn't say care about. He obviously cares about her, but, you know.
Right.
And I don't know, this is like so melodramatic middle school girl though, right? Because she's like, we are meant to be together. I don't want anyone else. Like, it won't change. Yeah. And he's like, you'll feel differently. And she's like, no, I won't.
Yep.
And that's when I'm just like, that's too much, dude. Like, chill out. Like, 3 days ago, this wasn't even happening. I don't know. I feel like people are going to be mad at me. I get she's a teenage girl. I get that they do that sometimes. I get that we, you know, blow things out of proportion. I'm not a teenage girl. I don't mean we. I just mean, like, I was there once, but it's just like a little too over dramatic in my opinion. And I know that she is a dramatic person. We've seen that.
Yep. This is not inconsistent with what we've seen of Colleen-centric episodes before. Yeah. Where she sobbed on a hay bale. And I think you kind of felt the same way and were like,
yeah,
really?
I did. And you were like, I understand.
I get it. I really do.
Yeah. Remind me of this when I have like a teenage daughter and you're like, this is normal. And I'm like, oh my gosh. But I think he brings up a good point that you've been alluding to this whole time, that, you know, stories are not real life. I don't want to be your hero. I want to be your friend. And that's what this should be about. And so, I don't know, his whole, like, at the end, like, oh, talk to you later. I'm like, that's not the best resolution that could have come from this. But I think it's true that he knows he can't sit there and, like, reason with her because she's not in that state of mind. And because she feels like she's
heartbroken,
in love with him. I get he's cool and gorgeous. Trust me, I do. I just don't understand why. I don't know. And I think, like you said, he fits this character that she's suddenly becoming obsessed with. And so it still bothers me. Sorry. Just gonna say it. It bothers me. And it's a hard conversation to have, but it is what it is.
You know, like in the Old West, I found this statistic. I don't know how accurate it is, but there was like a statistic that 74% of the population in the Old West was men. So how many choices does Colleen really have for people to create as her fantasy? We've seen Colleen be resilient, and we've seen her have these conversations with Dr. Mike about what's important to her. It changes. 13-year-olds don't know what they want. And this is where I would, as an English teacher, get up on my soapbox and be like, hey, if you have kids, invest in what they are reading and watching on television. Because you don't realize how much the stories that they are exposed to are going to form and influence the way that they see their relationships with other people. And I'm not just talking like romantic relationships. I'm talking about friendships, you know, relationships with people older than them, classmates, you know, teachers. One of the things that I admire most about our mom was that there was a chapter of my life when I was a teen, and there was a new book series that had come out, and most of the other parents weren't letting their kids read them, but I really wanted to read them. And mom was like, I'll tell you what, I will read all of them, and then I will let you know if I want you to read them or not. And she read them all, and she found nothing wrong with them. And before she let me read them, she sat me down and talked me through some of the points that other parents, were like, I don't want to have this hard conversation with my kid about this, content. And it had to do with like magic and sorcery and that kind of thing, which, we grew up in a more conservative Christian household. And
you're talking about Harry Potter, right?
Yeah, mom like sat me down and talked with me about it. And so I went into reading those books with wisdom and being able to discern for myself fantasy versus reality. And I think, especially if you look at the kind of content that is on our TVs every day, is on YouTube.
Yeah.
That kids, and I say kids meaning, toddlers through young adults, just the things that they are exposed to that I think so many parents don't realize and never have conversations with their kids about.
Right. Yeah.
It's really dangerous, and it messes up relationships, and then we get kids with porn addictions, or we get girls reading, these super sexualized romance novels. It really influences the way that they see romantic partnerships, and it's really dangerous. And so I don't think that was a big point of this episode, but it's a big point that I walk away wanting to have a conversation about and just be like, hey, do you know what your kid is reading? Do you know what your kid is watching? And right. I'm not saying censor everything either. I'm, like I said, my mom could have just as easily been like all those other parents who were like, I don't want to have this hard conversation with my kid. They're not going to read it. But I think mom set me up for success because then I learned how to discern my own entertainment and learned, what was appropriate, inappropriate, what was healthy and unhealthy for me with things with bigger, deeper than just magic or something like that,
Right.
And this is a hard conversation, and that it's uncomfortable to watch for Sully to be like stories and reality and relationships are more than rescuing someone, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that means she has to admire Sully any less. I don't think it means he can't be her hero, even though he says that. None of us ever thought it was weird how Brian really idolized Sully, but suddenly you add the teenage girl drama effect and we're like, this is inappropriate, but it doesn't have to be. That's why the conversation needs to be had. I guess I'm done with my speech.
We end the episode with Grace's cafe, and her business is booming. We've got lots of people there, including all of Dr. Mike's family and kids with Sully. We have a moment where Hank walks in, everybody's watching, it's weird, and we don't really know what's going to happen, but he sits down, and Robert E. and Grace look shocked, right? And I think Grace walks up almost ready to have a conversation, what do you want? You're not welcome here.
My favorite thing is, Robert E., I think, goes to confront him, and she pulls him back, and then the face Grace makes when she realizes she's holding a knife, and then she goes to put the knife down, I probably shouldn't carry this over to him.
But I do like how it's I got this, and then he's there for the meatloaf, just like everybody else. And so I'm assuming then this is the same day, and this is what bothers me, is another thing that bothers me. Shocker,
well,
guys.
Can we stay on the Hank thing for a second?
Okay.
I don't like this conclusion.
Yeah.
Because it flashes back to what I said, where I want to just be like, oh, just ignore Hank, he'll get over it. But it's really unfair that Robert E. and Grace have to just let him come eat.
Yeah, I know.
You treated her so horribly. You said some of the most racist things. And now you want to come in here. He doesn't apologize.
Eat her food?
Yeah, and just sits down and is like, okay, everything's fine now. And here's the thing. I'm like, this is why Grace is the better person, because she does forgive and she forgets and she's ready to just move past it and let, whatever, bygones be bygones. But when I think about how upset she was, what he called her in the mercantile, and she's like, how is that settling my differences? Right. That he's allowed to call me that and then walk away. I just want to be like, yeah, you're not welcome here. You don't get to eat here. You ruined that.
Right.
That's not warm, fluffy, feel good. But at the same time, I almost think it's I like it. I like that she forgives him. But at the same time, I'm like, what an unfair expectation to put on people, especially marginalized people groups, and be like, hey, I know that guy was a jerk to you, but you be the bigger person and forgive him.
Yeah.
And I know that's the right thing to do, but it feels so wrong.
Yeah. No, and I think it's a good point that you bring that up, because I think it's easy in a TV show to be like, oh, that's how this resolved, whatever. But no, I do think it's messed up, and I do think the fact that Hank can't admit that he's wrong, especially when it's not just like a tiny infraction, it's more serious than that.
Yeah, like, it's not like he just walked around town and said, don't eat at Grace's, her food made me sick. He, like, verbally and physically
assaulted both of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed, Hank, not my favorite, to say the least.
But this is why I need Jesus in my life. Because
Yes.
my instinct is to be hateful.
Yeah, no. Especially to people that are hateful and unkind, for sure.
Yeah.
So, thanks for Grace and Robert Eve teaching us a lesson. That's my lesson of this week. So, we're assuming it's been the same day, though, right? Because it's...
Yeah.
They're talking about meatloaf. Here's what bothers me is because Colleen goes to say hi to Lewis. And Lewis is like, oh, that's Sully. And she's like, yeah, we're just friends. Sorry, 8.5 seconds ago, you were in love with him and you swore that no one else could be for you.
Have you ever met a teenage girl?
Sorry, sure, I've been a teenage girl. I've felt the feelings of like,
they're
there's no one else
bipolar
for
as all
me.
get out.
It's the drama for me, okay? And you know what's gonna be really ironic is our mom is gonna listen to this podcast and then she's gonna call me and she's gonna be like, do you want to know who the most dramatic teenager middle schooler was?
Yeah, and you know
After
what she's gonna
Sarah.
say. Yeah, I was gonna say she's not gonna say you. She's gonna say me.
After you, she'll say me. And I know,
Do you know the number of times I have had girls fighting with each other, miserable, screaming, crying, hate each other, and the next day they come into school and they're fine and they're talking and they're laughing. And I'm just like, that was so much trauma for you two to just be okay today, but okay.
I know. I guess I'm too far removed from that part of my life that I'm just like, why you gotta be so dramatic, you guys?
You know what though, Kelly? I think you...
What are you about to say?
Yeah, you're wait for it. I'm gonna say it if you let me say it.
Okay.
You were always more mature for your age, and that's not to say that you didn't have immature moments, but I feel like even in your moments where you were immature, you always viewed yourself as more mature, maybe than your age let on.
I think that's a compliment, so thank you. But I'm taking it as a compliment, but I think it is a good point to say, yeah, our differing opinions. And so they end up talking, Colleen and Lewis end up talking about science, and they're talking about comets, and he's like, if I had a comet, I'd name it after you.
Part of me was like, oh, that's cheesy, but actually really smooth. But oh gosh, it's so cheesy.
No, that's like one of those pickup lines that you're like, what? Haha.
Well, it's in regards to, he mentions Maria Mitchell, who she lived from 1818 to 1889. She's the first female astronomer in the U.S. She was one of the most early advocates for science and math education for girls in the United States, and she discovered a comet which they named Miss Mitchell's Comet with only a 2-inch telescope, which is like, the bigger they are, the easier it is to see anomalies in the sky. And she received a gold medal from King Frederick VI of Denmark. And so I think it's cool, like, she likes science, she wants to be a doctor, and he, like, makes this connection of, like, this really amazing, like, let's be honest, Maria Mitchell and Michaela Quinn would probably have gotten along really well because they both were doing these jobs that were men's jobs.
Right.
And the point is that the comet she discovered was named after her. So him saying, if I discovered a comet, I wouldn't name it after myself. I would name it after you. He learned from his Uncle Horace.
I would have been like, thanks. And that is the conclusion of Heroes.
Hot take, the real hero of this episode is Wolf.
According to Sarah. Let's just,
No, for real. Colleen would have died. They wouldn't have found her.
I don't know if she would have... Well, yeah, she could have died. That's true.
Okay, favorite scene?
None of the above. I guess probably either the scene where like, I don't like the scene where Hank's being a jerk and Robert E. sticking up. I do like the scene maybe where Robert E. and Grace are having that conversation of like, I don't want to lose you again. And she's like, they're going to run me out of here. I thought you said you'd never send me away again. And so I like that interaction. I like that storyline through this. I guess I'll just pick the one where Grace and Robert E. are talking, but I like the
kiss.
Well, yeah, where she just is really grateful for him and saw that he tried, whether that means he beats up Hank or not. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I like the ending, actually. The conversation between Lewis and Colleen, I think, is good.
You're nice. That's nice. I'm just like, that's so dumb. She was in love with someone else like 5 seconds ago.
Come on. That's what fangirls are like. New show.
But you know I'm not like that. The only time I've ever really gotten to be a fangirl
Remember
was...
when you were in love with One Direction?
That was what I was going to say, and that was a very short period of my life, and it's over. So, that's all we have to say about that. I didn't think Harry Styles was in love with me. It's not equivalent. I shouldn't have said that. Still love Harry Styles, by the way, though. So, what are you thinking on episode ranking?
Is this, in your opinion, the worst episode?
It's probably my least liked. Like, right now, our last episode, which doesn't mean it's the worst, it's just, other stuff, is Father's Day. And if you were to ask me, would I watch this again or would I watch Father's Day again? I would watch Father's Day again. Okay. So that's me, but I know you have a differing opinion, so I know we can come to a compromise and move it up more if you'd like.
I did mention there were a couple points where I thought the writing wasn't so strong. This one just doesn't bother me as much as it bothers you.
Yeah, and that's okay. I respect that.
I wouldn't say this episode has the most iconic performances. They're not bad, they're not good, they're kind of just in the middle. What is the theme of this episode? Don't
fall in love with your mom's boyfriend.
Oh my gosh, no. I think it's like, don't put the pressure on people to become, your fantasy.
Right.
Don't endanger your life to win a boy.
Please. There's probably also some, stand up for who and what you believe in, maybe a little bit.
Yeah, sometimes the sub-storylines just really don't always pair well with the main storyline, like the subplots.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm like, that was the whole Hank thing. It was a really serious topic, and then meanwhile we got 13-year-olds in love. Obviously, the main conflict was like, I think supposed to be that Colleen might lose her hands, but we were distracted from the conflict is, can Colleen be with Sully? Or is Dr. Mike gonna lose Sully to Colleen?
Oh gosh, that was not plausible.
It's not the strongest, but I guess it just doesn't bother me. I feel bad for Colleen. We're kind of not nice to her storylines because it was her storyline in the healing that knocked the healing down lower too.
Yeah.
So should we make it below the healing, above Father's Day?
I'm comfortable with that.
Okay.
I really would like to know what the listeners think. And if you disagree with me, that is totally fine. If you disagree with Sarah, that's totally fine. Like, I'd really like to know your opinion about this because I think a lot of you are probably moms and grandmas and understand teenage girls. And maybe some of you do think it's over the top dramatic. And maybe you guys think the other storyline was more important. So please let us know your thoughts. We obviously take lessons and talk about those the beginning of the episode. You can always write us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Our website or our email are always good places to do that. Don't forget, it's notaladypodcast.weebly.com. Our email's on there as well. So please feel free to reach out to us. We would love to feature your thoughts and opinions. And we don't just pick the ones we like. We try to get a good variety in there. Some of you are faithful listeners and write us every time, so we appreciate that. But please let us know your thoughts and what do you think characters or you learned during this episode.
And next episode, we're talking about
the operation. I like this one. It's a good one, and it has a lot of medical stuff. Thanks for listening, guys. We appreciate you.
And we will talk to you in the next episode.
Bye.
Bye.
I think people are really going to be mad at me.